Hello, my name is Linda Evans. I'm here to present a continuation of our 2019-2020 season of programs entitled The Decades. Before COVID, we were able to present 3 of our programs in person at the Lansdale Borough Hall. They were the 1960s, narrated by Dick Shearer, the 1980s, brought to us by Bill Henning, and the 1950s, presented by Steve Moyer. Today we continue with the 1970s, and next month, the 1940s will be hosted by Marcia Althouse. Thank you for joining us. The decade of the 1970s, what a dichotomy. Peace and love, war and violence, a holdover from the 60s. There was division in our country like never before, young and old, liberal and conservative, black and white. The highs and lows of our country's news cycle, as well as the local news, were defined like few other times. It was a decade of shortages, rationing, inflation, price controls, hawks and doves, protests, women's rights, black power, and changing values. This program can only sample some of the bigger issues and stories without going into much detail. If you were there, you will probably remember most of these events as they happened. First, we'll take a look at some of the biggest news stories of the decade. Once upon a time, there was a hotel called Watergate. In the hotel was the headquarters of the Democratic National Committee. On June 17, 1972, some men broke into the hotel to plant bugs and steal secrets from the Democrats. Whether they found anything useful or not is of less importance than the fact that they got caught. The question then became who ordered the break-in. After a lot of beating around the bush, it was determined that even if President Nixon did not directly order the break-in, he did conspire to cover it up. Some of the bungling burglars and other top officials in the Nixon administration were sentenced to jail time. On August 9, 1974, Nixon became the first president in U.S. history to resign. Gerald Ford took over and later pardoned Richard Nixon. Interestingly, Ford, who was appointed vice president after Spiro Agnew resigned, became the first vice president and president never to have been elected. He lost to Jimmy Carter in 1976. The long and bitter saga of our involvement in Vietnam would be the topic for another program or two. The end finally came on April 30th, 1975, when the communists entered Saigon. We all remember the dramatic pictures of overloaded helicopters taking off and other empty helicopters being pushed into the sea. The after effects of that war still haunt us today, causing a divide even among veterans. North Penn High School graduates who perished are remembered in a separate memorial on the grounds of Penndale Middle School. Many protests against the war happened on college campuses, most tragically the one at Kent State University in Ohio in May of 1970. The National Guard fired on students, killing 4. It is still unclear who gave the order to fire, or if no order, why the firing commenced. Within 2 weeks, the song Ohio, written by Neil Young and performed by Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young, was receiving airplay on the radio. An example of how the Woodstock Nation could communicate quickly even without the use of cell phones or Facebook. In little over a year, James Michener published his exhaustively researched book on the shootings, concluding that it was a tragic accident. In March of 1979, an incident at the nuclear plant in Middletown, PA, caused nationwide panic and conjecture about what could possibly happen in a meltdown. A radiation leak occurred after a partial meltdown. Eventually, it was recommended that children and pregnant women be evacuated from the area. The nation held its breath as experts and politicians tried to determine the severity of the leak and how to handle it. Jimmy Carter, trained while in the Navy in nuclear power, visited the plant in early April. Although many claim that higher rates than usual of cancers occurred in the area, it was determined that human exposure to radiation was minimal. With the outbreak of the coronavirus, we feel compelled to mention that a disease that turned out to be pneumonia was traced to a hotel in Philadelphia and became known as Legionnaire's disease. A convention of the American Legion was held at the Bellevue Stratford Hotel in July of 1976. About 130 people, mostly men, were taken ill, and about 30 died. The gas shortages of the 1970s reduced us to waiting in line to purchase gas, depending on the number on our license plate, odd or even. Then there was also the toilet paper shortage. Sound familiar? There was a perceived shortage after Congressman Harold V. Froelich, a Republican from Wisconsin, issued a warning about the possibility that we might be running out. Carson picked up the story and joked about it, and the panic started. We all know what that looks like. After 4 months, it was all over. Houston, we have a problem. The third Apollo space flight took place in April of 1970 and was meant to land on the moon, but because of technical problems, it didn't happen. Everyone made it back safely. The first Earth Day happened on April 22, 1970. The 50th anniversary was observed on April 22, 2020. Our nation celebrated its 200th birthday. I'll cover this later when I talk about how Lansdale celebrated this occasion. I want to cover some changes in TV programming instead of just naming programs. All in the Family debuted in 1971 and was on the air until 1979. Norman Lear's spin on the family sitcom was to pit conservative Archie Bunker against his liberal daughter and son-in-law, Gloria and Mike Stivic, Meathead as he was known to Archie. Archie's loyal wife Edith tried, but usually failed, to act as a buffer. Weekly, the show covered the controversial issues of the 1970s in an entertaining but provocative way. It certainly got the conversation going in many households, most likely leading to many heated arguments as well. Many of us remember a particular week when Archie met Sammy Davis Jr. The spin-offs from All in the Family included The Jeffersons, 1975 to 1984, Archie's Place, 1979 to 1983, and Maude, 1972 to 1978. MASH was adapted from the 1970 feature film, the first season airing in 1972. It stayed on the air until 1983, much longer than the Korean conflict. It could be called a drama and comedy, for it presented comic situations and dialogue against a background of the Korean conflict. Of course, to many, it was a commentary on the present war in Vietnam. The final 2.5-hour episode was watched by 125 million viewers. Saturday Night Live debuted in 1975 and is still going strong today. The late 1960s saw an increase of black actors on TV, notably Bill Cosby in I Spy and Diane Carroll in Julia. Several sitcoms featuring black or mixed families debuted in the 1970s, including The Jeffersons, Benson, Different Strokes, Good Times, and Sanford and Son. Some may argue that the biggest event in TV in the 1970s was the miniseries Roots. Based on a book by Alex Haley, which won a Pulitzer Prize, it traces the author's ancestry back to Kunta Kinte, an African captured and transported to America. ABC took a chance and decided to air the 8-part series on consecutive nights instead of weekly. It introduced LeVar Burton in the main role. It was a hit, winning 9 Emmys, a Golden Globe, and a Peabody Award. Are you ready for some football? Monday Night Football premiered in September of 1970 with Howard Cosell, Don Meredith, and Keith Jackson. Remember how we always used to laugh when told we would someday have to pay to watch TV? The 1970s made that a reality with the rise of cable TV, introducing new networks like TBS, HBO, Showtime, and ESPN. Along with cable, we now had the VCR, video cassette recorder. With all the new TV programming, we had to have some way to control our viewing time. VCRs enabled us to record and watch a show at our leisure. Now let's look at some of the films of the 1970s, including the winners of the Best Picture Oscar. These are only a few, of course. We can also mention American Graffiti, Carrie, Deliverance, Animal House, Serpico, The Last Picture Show, Dirty Harry, Monty Python and the Holy Grail, and many more great movies from the 70s. Now we'll move on to music. It's impossible to cover music of the 1970s in a show like this. We all have our favorite groups and records, and I'm sorry I can't cover more of them. In 1970, the Beatles announced that they were splitting. Their last public performance was the famous rooftop concert in 1969. All 4 ex-Beatles began to record and release solo projects. Paul McCartney put out his solo album, McCartney. Ringo Starr took us on a sentimental journey. John and Yoko asked us to imagine. But perhaps the most surprising was George Harrison's opus, All Things Must Pass. George had accumulated quite a backlog of material, having been prevented from including many of his works on Beatle albums. FM radio began playing records differently. Called AOR, or Album-Oriented Rock, DJs began playing cuts off of albums, not just the singles that the record companies were pushing. No longer were we buying albums because of one or two songs. We wanted to hear the whole thing. Rock groups continued to play in big concert venues like the Spectrum in Philadelphia and even outdoor stadiums. That brings us to another change in record albums, cover art. Instead of a picture of the artist in a close-up or some pleasant pose, album covers were becoming works of art. I'd like to show you some of these album covers. Hopefully you can hear the music in your head. We have Woodstock, the soundtrack from the movie Woodstock. In the middle, Layla by Derek and the Dominoes, which was actually Eric Clapton and Chicago Transit Authority. Simon and Garfunkel, Bridge Over Troubled Water. Fleetwood Mac, Rumors. Pink Floyd, Dark Side of the Moon. David Bowie, Ziggy Stardust and the Spiders from Mars. The Rolling Stones, Let It Bleed. Stevie Wonder, Songs in the Key of Life. Marvin Gaye with What's Going On. And the Jackson 5, ABC. Electric Light Orchestra, Out of the Blue. Deja Vu by Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young. And Tea for the Tillerman by Cat Stevens. Paul McCartney's new group Wings with Band on the Run. Joni Mitchell usually featured her own artwork on her album covers. We also have Bob Dylan, Blood on the Tracks. Jimi Hendrix, Jim Morrison and the Doors, and Janis Joplin. All three of these artists died at the age of 27. Hendrix and Joplin died in 1970, and Jim Morrison died in 1971. If we're talking about the music of the 1970s, we can't forget our local favorites, Hall & Oates. John Oates, who lived in North Wales and graduated from North Penn High School, and Daryl Hall from Pottstown met at Temple University. Although their musical fame began in the late 1960s, their hits from the 70s include Rich Girl, Sarah Smile, Wait for Me, She's Gone, and Fall in Philadelphia. Here's what they looked like in the 70s. They continued making hits into the 80s and beyond. In January of 1973, Hall & Oates, known at that time as Whole Oats, played at the new North Penn High School. I really have to include Al Stewart because he's my favorite singer. If you know him at all, it's probably from one of his hits, Year of the Cat, Time Passages, or A Song on the Radio. However, Al found a real musical niche for himself writing historical songs. He wrote about World War II, the Spanish Civil War, American presidents, English history, world explorers, and many other topics. So if you like history, you should certainly check out Al Stewart. He frequently appears in this area. In May of 1974, Al was the opening act for Robert Klein at the Lansdale Theater. For the sake of time, I have only two things to say about disco. Lastly, we cannot forget the passing of the king, Elvis Presley, on August 16, 1977. Now let's look at some sports highlights of the 1970s. At the 1976 Winter Olympics in Montreal, Nadia Comaneci, a 14-year-old Romanian gymnast, scored 7 perfect tens. The scoreboard was not set up to show a score of 10. Billie Jean King played Bobby Riggs in a tennis match known as the Battle of the Sexes. King won all 3 sets, which took place in 1973 at the Houston Astrodome. In 1973, Secretariat became the first horse in 25 years to win the Triple Crown. Seattle Slew also achieved this accolade in 1977, and the horse Affirmed in 1978. In 1974, Hammer and Hank Aaron tied and then surpassed Babe Ruth's home run record of 714. Hank passed away in 2021. The Thriller in Manila, Muhammad Ali versus Smokin' Joe Frazier, 1975, went for 14 rounds, and Ali won by a technical knockout. Ali opened his training camp in Deer Lake, Pennsylvania in 1972. The Steelers won 4 Super Bowls, including 2 back-to-back, 1974, 1975, and 1978-1979. Philadelphia gained a new sports venue, Veterans Stadium. The Phillies spent the 70s building their team for their 1980 World Series victory. They also acquired a new announcer, Harry Kalas. The Eagles signed head coach Dick Vermeil in 1976. A memorable play happened at the Meadowlands in 1978. Late in the game, with victory assured, the New York Giants fumbled the ball. With the score at 17-12 Giants, it was picked up by Eagle Herman Edwards, who ran 26 yards for the winning touchdown. The play is still known as the Miracle at the Meadowlands. The Flyers, also known as the Broad Street Bullies, won 2 Stanley Cups, the 1973-74 season and the 1974-75 season. Now we'll head on to a look at our local news. We opened a new high school in November of 1971. The first class to graduate was the class of 1972. This shot is an aerial view of the high school under construction. At the beginning of the decade, the class of 1970 numbered 593, the largest class at that time. By 1979, the class size had only increased by a little over 100 to 709 graduates. In fact, even after opening the new high school, student population declined in the 1970s, and 2 elementary schools were closed in 1979, Line Street and J. Henry Speck. Here's a popular fad of the 1970s, streaking, that even hit our high school, and these are teachers. On October 27, 1970, the North Penn Reporter celebrated its 100th birthday by holding an open house that attracted 2,500 people. North Penn Hospital was growing as well. This is the groundbreaking in Hatfield Township in 1977 for the new North Penn Hospital. The new building opened in 1980. The Montgomery Mall opened in 1977, and Outtown Lansdale was never the same. Lansdale Day was started in 1978 by the Rotary Club and is still going strong. This photo of Mischief Night is also from 1978 and was one of the most popular pictures on Dick's Facebook page for a while. Now we'll look at a few local ads from the North Penn Reporter. Here we have an ad for Mason Beauty Shop and Al's Shoe Center. Brenninger Motors was selling the Aspen. How many people have bought an Aspen? I think that was a Dodge. And King's Department Store, which was later the location of Ames, and today is the Big Lots and the Ace Hardware. Clemens's, one of our 2 local well-known stores, Clemens's and Ralph's. Also an ad for WMPV Sports Scope with Jim Church. And Ralph's, they're one of their older stores on West Main that later became a Cleaners, and the building is now no longer there. And then the Ralph's at West Main, which is now the West Main Diner, and a convenience store. Evelyn Gussman, excuse me. Evelyn Gussman was a popular dance instructor for many years in Lansdale, and we had a Woolworths on West Main Street. Puritan Factory made men's clothing, and also an ad for an open house for Bolly Thompson, who was retiring after 44 years of musical service to the community. Now we're moving to a darker side of local news. The Lansdale Community Improvement Association began to take a critical look at Lansdale's older buildings. This resulted in the demolition of some of our iconic structures. Beinhackers came down in 1970. We lost the Lansdale Theater in 1979. Over 60 buildings were demolished in between. In January of 1971, the Sunday magazine of the Philadelphia Inquirer, called Today, had a cover story on the town of Lansdale. Those who knew it was in the works expected it to be a pleasant story about the attributes of our town. It turned out to be an expose of the youth culture, drugs, and suicide. The author expressed in his disclaimer that this is happening in many towns, but of course we took it personally. The deluge of letters that inundated the North Penn Reporter in the days after the publication caused the editor to establish a special section. Many letters slammed the author, some agreed with him to some extent, and a few actually offered some constructive ideas. The mayor at the time, Hugh Cullen, promised to set up a special commission on youth. I believe that helpline may have come out of this. It opened in October of 1971. On March 19, 1971, a major public drug bust went down at the high school, with 6 people being arrested. November 24, 1974, a fire was called into the Fairmont Fire Company at 11:35 a.m. When the company arrived at the scene of the Allied Paint Company on West 3rd Street, they found 2 warehouses used for storage of paint thinner and other flammable liquids completely engulfed. Aerosol cans were flying through the air, and heavy black smoke was drifting east over the borough. The first concern was preventing the fire from spreading to nearby homes and the main office of the company. Paint cans began exploding. Even 50-gallon paint drums flew like missiles through the air. One landed in front of the VFW post on West 2nd Street, about a block away from the plant. 100 firemen from 8 fire companies fought the blaze, which was miraculously brought under control within an hour by 12:15 p.m. with no loss of life. Several firemen were treated for smoke inhalation. However, the total damage was estimated to be $350,000, $1.8 million in today's money. April 9, 1977, around 1:30 a.m., a neighbor called the fire company to Wedgwood Park for a house fire. Firemen were unable to get to the bedrooms of the 4 children in the house because of the way it was constructed, in 5 staggered layers. The siblings ranged in age from 2 years to 9 years. The source of the fire was arson, but the responsible person was never identified. On December 11, 1976, a Montgomery Township police officer, David Hancock, responded to a burglar alarm at the JCPenney Auto Center on the grounds of the not-yet-open Montgomery Mall. In a scuffle, the suspected burglar, Larry Phillips, grabbed Officer Hancock's service revolver and fatally shot him. Phillips was caught, convicted of murder, and sentenced to life in prison. Officer Hancock was 41 years old and a 10-year veteran of the force. He was survived by his wife and 2 children. Now we'll take a look at 2 major celebrations that took place in Lansdale in the 1970s. I'll actually start with the second of the events, the Bicentennial. Lansdale put on quite a show for the 200th anniversary of our nation in 1976. Even more incredible, this came after a major celebration of Lansdale's Centennial in 1972. Headed by Robert Gaskill, who had been second in command for the 72 shindig, the Bicentennial brought an amazing event to our town. Here's the program for all the events that were planned from June 4th until December 11th. The highlights being the festival Sunday on June 20th and the National Wagon Train encampment on July 2nd and 3rd. It was also the beginning of the annual football classic between North Penn and Lansdale Catholic. Here's a cannon firing. This was a concert in Memorial Park. A bike parade. Square dancing. A water battle. This is our fairly new Lansdale Historical Society in colonial costumes. Frank and Annette Krim. Annette was our president for a while of the Historical Society, and Frank is still involved with us. Paul Ahrens, a high school student, portrayed George Washington and several other historical figures. Here's a flag in the parade. Most exciting of all was the Bicentennial wagon train, which left their previous stop in Quakertown to make their way down 309 to Lansdale on July 2nd. This is Richard Bittner on the left, on horseback in colonial garb. Here's a better picture of him where you can see his costume in color. Stopping overnight on the grounds of Penndale Middle School, it created quite a sensation. Afterwards, the wagon train made its way out of town by Valley Forge Road on its way to Valley Forge Park. President Ford declared Valley Forge a national park in 1976. In 1872, Lansdale was quietly incorporated as a borough in the state of Pennsylvania. Formerly known as the Mud Hole, Lansdale came to be in the 1850s when a surveyor for the North Pennsylvania Railroad came to this area to scout out a place for a junction, where the track would split into 2, one headed toward Bethlehem and the other to Doylestown. That surveyor was Philip Lansdale Fox. We don't know exactly why his middle name was chosen to mark the new railroad station. We do know that Fox was very well liked by the people with whom he came into contact. So in the early 1970s, it was time to begin planning a special celebration. A group of people had the foresight to realize that one of the oldest homes in Lansdale, now up for sale, was in danger of being demolished. The home was built by the Jenkins family, the original settlers of our area. Banding together, the group convinced the Lansdale Borough Council to buy the home. The council agreed if the concerned citizens would form a historical society to restore and preserve the home. In 1971, the Lansdale Historical Society was born and did just that. The Jenkins homestead is preserved at 137 Jenkins Avenue, along with the Richard Shearer Research Center and Library adjacent. As we focus our attention on the 100th anniversary of Lansdale, which happened in 1972, we may want to file away some thoughts on how we will celebrate our sesquicentennial coming up in 2022. The Centennial celebration took place from May 27th to June 3rd, 1972. Many events were planned. Here are a few. We have a Centennial Ball, a concert in Memorial Park by the Allentown Band, the Centennial Court featuring Maureen Wimmer, Miss Pennsylvania, who is from Percy, and a carnival. Here's a picture in Memorial Park of people sitting on the cannon, and in the background you can see the fountain with the original water feature. We had a block party by the old fire station, a costume parade of local citizens. We had the tour of yesteryear, which took people to such sites as the Morgan Log Home, the Peter Wentz Home, and the Jenkins Homestead, and a concert in what we now know as Railroad Plaza with Bolly Thompson. The women were organized as the Centennial Belles, and the men had activities as Brothers of the Brush. They vowed to stop shaving from late April until early June, and here they are burying razors. Here are the winners of the facial hair contest. On the left is our friend Harold Jenkins, and here we have the public shaving near the railroad station, and that's Willard Kriebel on the right taking pictures. We had a flea market at the Jenkins homestead that had just been saved. Here's another shot with the view of the old water tower. Another thing we got out of our Centennial celebration was Century Plaza. There were 3 parades during this week-long celebration. This is the Firemen's Parade. What I like about these pictures are how you can see our town almost 50 years ago and take a look at the stores that we remember. Here we can see the Lansdale Theater in the background. Here's one of Willard Kriebel's Just for Fun shots. Our mayor, Hugh Cullen, was arrested and tried in Kangaroo Court. His crime? Riding around in police cars and cutting ribbons. You can see his punishment. And here's our future mayor, Mike D'Annunzio. So not only did we have a fireman's parade, we had Memorial Day parade, but this is our showing our main parade, which was the Centennial parade. Here on the right you can see the density of the crowd. It was estimated that 45,000 people viewed the parade. Here's another long shot with a lot of our stores on the right side. And here's how we got a lot of these long shots, with a bucket truck with Willard Kriebel, and the other man was Roy Blackledge. This shot you can see all the way down to St. John's on the left, and even further you can see the steeple of Trinity Lutheran Church. And the building on the right side near us, it has been demolished. Here's the Queen and her court. The Queen was Dee Dinlocher. And on the right again we have Maureen Wimmer, Miss Pennsylvania. Here's our float with our new Lansdale Centennial seal. Here we have two long shots. On the left we're looking west on Main Street, and on the right we're looking east. And this is our last shot, a wide view of our town almost 50 years ago. And of course, we always had fireworks. Once again, thank you for joining us.